within the Gospel of Mark, we have a very different gospel. Matthew and Luke both have extensive genealogies which trace different family lines. Mark has none of this. One of those speaks to Jesus' early childhood. Mark has none of this. All Mark has, which is really interesting, is the things that could have been verified by Peter.
Let the scriptures speak for themselves.
If you're unaware of the way the story is usually woven, it goes a little like this. And before I tell you the story, the reason that I've taught through the Gospel of Mark first on my YouTube channel is for the very reason that I've believed for many years that Mark was written first. It's really the scholarly consensus. I've quite frankly never heard a different argument. That's the only thing I've ever heard. Everyone's unanimously agreed on it, even though I've been in church for many years. I've been to seminary. I'm a voracious reader of nonfiction books, especially concerning biblical things. But I've never heard until delving into these various books, the idea that possibly Matthew was written first. And so this is how the story is usually woven by both critical, non-Christian biblical critics or scholars like Bart Ehrman, in the same way that maybe conservative, evangelical, faithful, Orthodox Christians like, say, Daniel Wallace argues that the story goes like this. Mark was written first, and it was written pretty early. Again, scholars debate as to how early it was, but there's a consensus, usually for the most part, that Mark was written first and it was written early. And after many years, what happened is that Luke and Matthew wanted to give their separate accounts of the same gospel story. And so in critical scholarship, or what's known as textual criticism, which I think has some helpful uses, and in some ways, on the other side, it's had some detrimental effects and overly severe skepticism. The story is woven. Mark was written early. Mark was written first. Then Luke and Matthew wanted to write their own versions of the gospel for whatever reasons, and they used both Mark and what's called the Q source. Q stands for quill, and there's lots of debate and lots of books that have been written the past 200 years concerning what Q was, what Q is. If you've never heard about this, it's usually called Q source, Q for quill. And Q source, according to scholars, is this collection of writings of the early teachings and sayings of Jesus. And this is a document that's conjecture, right? We've never picked up a copy of this document. It's just assumed that there was a document that is now lost to history that was source Q. And so Luke and Matthew, which were written much later, used both Mark's gospel and Q source to later write their gospels, which were published later. And then I read David Allen Black's book on Why Four Gospels, the Historical Origins of the Gospels. And it was not unlike that one Terminator scene where my views just got completely blown up and caused me to reconsider everything.
I'll be back.
So this is just going to be a brief summary of this book, my understanding of it, and it's going to be incomplete. It's going to be imperfect. It's going to be missing certain things. But what I would like to do is just give you a brief overview, and I would strongly encourage you to read this book. Of the many books that I read for this video, for this debate, this topic, this was one of the easier ones. It wasn't so scholarly that it was like chewing on a piece of wood. It was actually more like chewing on a piece of gum. And so this video, in this section of this video, I just want to briefly hit on the argument. Essentially, in Why Four Gospels, David Allen Black argues that each gospel was written by a particular person for a particular reason, for a particular occasion, with a particular audience, in a particular time. And while that's the case, these things were not done wholly independent of each other. So as he argued in the Four Views book, which he essentially is saying the same thing here in this whole book dedicated to the topic, for his purpose in the Four Views book, again, as already stated, he ultimately argues that Mark hands out a bunch of copies, and people begin to circulate and copy those, and then he himself, upon the death of Peter, out of piety and respect, then finishes his personal copy and publishes it, and then those copies are passed around. So we already addressed his view of the ending of Mark and why it's there, but I think this lays over top a more fundamental question, a more essential question to the nature of this debate. And so while we're thinking about the ending of Mark, what we also need to be thinking about is the purpose of Mark and the purpose of all of the Gospels. And as already stated, he paints a very different picture. So we talked about Q source, and we talked about Markan priority. And again, when I say Markan priority, it's a scholarly view that Mark was written first and then gobbled up by the other Gospels along with Q source. And so David Allen Black, along with other scholars, they believe in maybe what would be called Matthean priority, or in other words, that Matthew was written first. And so this solves a couple issues. For one, it really burns at the stake years and years and years of speculation and research concerning Q source, because the Gospel of Matthew is a very document that is focused on specific sayings of Jesus. And so because we date, if you're following with me, because we date Mark first and we say it was written first and then Matthew's written later, but what in the world? Matthew's got all this collections of sayings of Jesus, and so does Luke. How does he have this? There must therefore be a Q source document. Well, if Matthew was written first, then this document containing all the sayings and teachings of Jesus, that's way more expansive than the Gospel of Mark, is there early and it's there in the beginning, and there's no need for a hypothetical Q source that we've never stumbled upon archaeologically or discovered, but rather Matthew is Q source. There's no need for Q source. Matthew is the book. And then Mark and Luke are copied from it. So to walk you through his history, I just want to briefly explain when the books were written, why they were written. So first we would have Matthew written very, very early. And it's hard to precisely date the year of these books because they don't contain the year. But with an educated guess, Matthew would have been the book written during the time of course, the Apostle Matthew following around with Jesus. He could have written it while he was out doing ministry with Jesus during the 3 years after he became a follower, or it could have been in the years following. But there's an argument that David Allen Black, he calls it the Jerusalem Church's Gospel Manifesto, not unlike the Communist Manifesto. And so what he means is that because the Jews were such a literate group, because the Jews were such an educated group who were so focused on the book, namely the Septuagint in Greek, they needed another document after or during the ministry of Jesus or after to really verify these prophecies that were being fulfilled in his life. So whether during or after, Matthew decided to collect these sayings, collect these teachings, and whittle them down to a scroll and compact them all so they'd fit into a scroll, and then have something that could be copied and passed around for the Jerusalem church. So David Allen Black dates the Gospel of Matthew to be in circulation, passed around, being used heavily by the Jerusalem Jewish church from about year 30 to year 42. And he calls that the Jerusalem age, or the time of Jerusalem. And again, Jesus' teaching was this. He said that he wanted his disciples to focus on Jerusalem, and then after they had finished their focus there, then to go to the various parts, to Jerusalem, Judea, and all of Samaria, and to the uttermost, to the ends of the world. So this is a theory that is based in Scripture. This is a theory that's based in the commands of Christ. And again, we have no reason to doubt that this was the case. So there's a strong case here for this. Again, all these are theories, but I think it's a theory with some biblical support and some weight behind it. And so Matthew would have written this down. And then at the end of year 42, we have a couple things culminating. So he dates the next section. So he calls the first one the Jerusalem phase, which he timestamps around Acts chapter 1 to Acts chapter 12, which is specifically under the leadership of Peter. Again, would have lasted till around, let's say, 42 AD, somewhere around there. The second phase, he would call it the Gentile mission phase, which he timestamps at about Acts chapter 13 to Acts chapter 28. And this is where, as in opposition to Peter, the church really began to flourish under the leadership of Paul, and the church really began to grow in regards to Gentile converts and believers. And so he dates this around 42 to, I believe, early 60s. But with that, maybe late 50s, I'll find that later in this video, but he dates it from 42 to them, and this is the Gentile mission phase. And what he argues is that what we have going on is that Paul, he is called as an apostle to the Gentiles. And for this reason, a letter that is brilliant and beautiful, but focused on the Jewish people, the Jewish church, it is helpful and good and true in every sense, but it's not catered to the right audience. It's the right message for the wrong audience. And so what he theorizes, which I think makes a lot of sense, is that Paul then needed a verified document that would be approved by the other apostles, namely Peter, one of the chief leaders in the early church, and John, and maybe some of the others, let's say. He needed another gospel document that was approved in effort to unify the church that was so divided. There was Judaizing going on, and there was division between Gentile and Jew within the church, and this wasn't God's desire. So he needed something that is for the Gentile church, but does not cause disunity within the church. It is verified by the Jewish church's leaders and apostles and elders. And so what he speaks to is around the early 60s. Before the early 60s, Luke is gathering evidence, gathering data, because, again, remember, neither Paul nor Luke were eyewitnesses of the Christ. And so they had to verify their stories, and it really did need the apostles' approval, namely that of Peter and the others, because they were the true eyewitnesses. And so Luke, being a doctor and some might argue a historian, does excellent work and research to gather this gospel. And the occasion of the Gospel of Mark, I'll tell you why we're going here. The occasion, the whole purpose of the Gospel of Mark is that during this 5-series lecture, if you will, 5-lecture series, all that Peter is doing is he's taking a scroll of Matthew and he's taking a scroll of Luke, and he's trying to stamp his approval on the Gospel of Luke so it can be sent out to the Gentiles. And he's doing that by verifying everything that he was an eyewitness testimony of concerning the things found within the Gospel of Matthew. And so when we follow the the ordering of Mark, that's actually what we find. We find that it's almost as if there was a planned thing where someone was going through these stories of Matthew and Luke, and within the Gospel of Mark, we have a very different gospel. Matthew and Luke both have extensive genealogies which trace different family lines. Mark has none of this. One of those speaks to Jesus' early childhood. Mark has none of this. All Mark has, which is really interesting, is the things that could have been verified by Peter. It has the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, in which John the Baptist baptizes him, and it closes at the very end, which is still up for debate, verses 8 or 20. This gospel closes with the resurrection. And so again, if Matthew was written first, this makes a lot of sense. And if this is true, this makes a lot of sense. And so Peter's preaching, reading through Matthew, and for the purpose of verifying the gospel according to Luke. And in this occasion, in this scenario, there's many important people listening on. And as well, the follower, disciple of Christ, Mark, is recording this for Peter and maybe even helping him during this time. And so it says, according to the church fathers, everyone asked Peter, and we'll get to the church father evidence in just a minute, but all of the crowds wanted copies of Peter's message. And so it seems that Peter never actually intended to write his own separate gospel, because he thought everything that was needed in the gospel according to Matthew for the Jewish audience was all there and all that was necessary. And everything that we find in the gospel of Luke was perfect for the Gentile community, to speak into that kind of audience. And so it seems that Peter and Mark didn't, according to David Allen Black in his theory, didn't just go about to write a third gospel for no reason, but rather the way it came about was during this preaching, people were so enamored by this eyewitness testimony of Peter that they wanted record of his preaching. And that's why I think really helps explain the early church fathers when they record, and multiple of them record that Peter was indifferent to Mark publishing his gospel. I remember the first time I read that when I was studying this, I was like, what do you mean Peter was indifferent to this gospel being published? That's a weird view. That's a weird idea. You know, how can I swallow this? But again, I was reading with the view that Mark was written first. And so if you look back to my introduction to the gospel according to Mark, I remember reading that early church father reference, and it was kind of strange, but I just kind of was like, all right. But it makes so much more sense now. If Matthew is written first and Luke is before Peter being verified in his very eyes to be sent to the Gentile world, it makes sense that he would be indifferent as to if there's another gospel, because Matthew and Luke are such great gospels. And so essentially this is David Allen Black's argument that there was the Jerusalem phase, where the gospel according to Matthew reigned supreme for the church in that situation. Then there was the Gentile phase, in which Paul's ministry really was taking off, and those Gentile churches were really growing. And there's a need for this second gospel, the Gospel of Luke, in which through this occasion, the Gospel of Mark came about. And then after this, he would note a Roman phase in which he would date this gospel being written, I think, in the early 60s, where Paul's imprisonment and Peter being in Rome, all these guys being in Rome, having an occasion for this to go down. And this lines up with church history that Peter was in Rome, Paul was in Rome. And so Peter giving this address is not a foreign made-up concept. This was very likely and very possible. And once we get into the early church fathers' accounts of this, seems to be what took place. And then lastly, he would record the Johannine or John's gospel for the fourth and final gospel, which many argue was written around the 90s. So this is after the destruction of the temple. And it was written for the purpose of the audience of Jesus is really for the future, seemingly, the audience of the church for us today. And again, we can look over the shoulders, and all these Gospels are valuable and important. I think even the Gospel of Mark has its place, even though it might not have even originally been intended by Peter. I think it bears that testimony. But John's Gospel audience was that of looking at the gospel from an eternal perspective. And that's why we have John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So this is kind of the overview. That's the story that David Allen Black presents of Matthew being written first, the gospel manifesto for the Jewish church, and then Luke being written as almost a Gentile church manifesto of the gospel, the same gospel, verified, but for the different unique audience with different questions and concerns. And then Mark being that bridge between the two. And again, this is why some argue, and some of the church fathers argue that Mark is placed where it is, in between the Gospel of Matthew, which came first, and then Mark, which was used as the bridge to introduce and verify and confirm this Gospel of Luke. So I think it's a very compelling case, and for me, really changed my mind. And we'll get to the early church fathers now and look at some of that evidence, which was a big brunt of this book, and a very helpful section. Again, I couldn't more highly recommend this book. It was very helpful and very easily readable. So whether you agree with it or not, this view really solves a couple problems, as already stated. It solves the immense problem of this Q-source document, which is extremely significant. It solves the problem, secondly, of the early church fathers who actually all unanimously say that Matthew was written first, which we'll look at. And then thirdly, it solves the problem of understanding why the Gospel of Mark wasn't so widely circulated. And again, if it was merely a bridge between these two Gospels, it would actually make sense why this manuscript tradition points to the reality that Mark wasn't the highest valued Gospel. It was Matthew that was the highest valued manuscript, and then we have Luke, and then Mark wasn't as valued. And this would make sense because, again, it wasn't the primary gospel. It wasn't the first written, nor was it for that purpose of one of those two main audiences, but rather served as a bridging document. And so, again, not to say that it's unimportant, but it had different purposes. So for those three reasons, I think this seems to clear up a lot of problems for scholarship. And again, this is rooted in Scripture. We don't have hard evidence for any of these positions concerning the longer ending of Mark. But this does help to cast some biblical light on what things would be like if the disciples did walk and obey Jesus' commands and the gospel tradition. This is called the fourfold hypothesis, according to scholars, and speaks to this, and very similar to what scholars call the twofold gospel hypothesis, although there's some differences between those two views. So the last book that I read in studying for and researching for the longer ending of Mark was this book here that you see on the screen, The Original Ending of Mark, a new case for the authenticity of Mark 16, verse 9 through 20. This again was written by Nicholas P. Lunn, and he is a scholar in the original sense. The outline of his book is like this. There's 11 chapters. First, he goes through an introduction, and then 2 chapters of external evidence, followed by 2 chapters of linguistic evidence, followed by literary, thematic, evidences, and then he covers its relationship to the Gospels, random issues, and then he traces the root cause of the problem, and then he gives some concluding thoughts. This book, by far, for me personally, in my chronological timeline of study, put the final nail in the coffin to prove to me that, for me personally, Mark 16, verse 9 through 20 is canonical, is authentic, and quite possibly written by Mark, which I'll talk on in just a minute. But the external evidence, I think, for this book was extremely significant. Took me back to Eusebius, took me back to Jerome. And what we find, and this is what I want you to look for, and I really hope you learn something lifelong and valuable from this video. If you're watching to this point, what I want you to learn is that the evidence isn't always as it appears to be. And what I mean by that is a half-truth in some ways is a lie. So if someone quotes Eusebius or Jerome and they say, well, the way to reconcile the issue is to deal with the fact that, say, this section, verse 9 through 20, is non-canonical. It's not in the earliest and best manuscripts. And that would be a completely accurate and true quotation from both Eusebius and Jerome. Now, here's the problem. This is quoting them out of context. And what Nicholas P. Lunn points out as we get to these external evidence chapters, namely 2 and 3, is that when we read Jerome and we read Eusebius in context, they're giving two possible ways of responding to the issue of synchronization of the resurrection accounts. In other words, Eusebius is speaking, and Jerome just repeats exactly what he says to deal with the same issue. So essentially, someone writes Eusebius, says, hey, Eusebius, how do I reconcile this resurrection passage from the ending of Mark with the other Gospels? And Eusebius says, here's two possible solutions. The first possible solution for someone who doesn't consider the ending of Mark canonical, well, you just reject it. Or if you do consider it canonical, here's how you read it. Read it kind of like as if a comma were here and pronounce it this way. Then he goes about his business. And again, let's remember this. This is important. By the very nature of someone writing to Eusebius, namely Marinus, I believe is his name, or Marinum, by the very nature of this person writing on how to harmonize verse 9 through 20, they have a copy of 9 through 20 that they're reading. And so they're writing in not to ask if it's canonical. They're writing in to ask, how do we reconcile this with the other gospel resurrection accounts? Again, this is exactly the same thing that happens with Jerome. Someone is writing him to not ask if Mark chapter 16, verse 9 through 20 is canonical. They're not asking that. They already are holding that it's canonical, and they're writing to ask how they synchronize it with the other resurrection accounts. And he just repeats verbatim Eusebius. And so the point here is that neither of these, and we'll explain later, but neither of these are, as Nicholas P. Lunn points out, good credible witnesses against the longer ending of Mark. If anything, we could quote them. At worst, I would say it's inconclusive. At best, they both are actually strong evidence for the longer ending of Mark, which was quite surprising to me. If you read scholars, they're almost unanimous that Eusebius and Jerome are always cited as evidence against the longer ending of Mark. And then I got to reading, as Nicholas Lunn points out, reading those quotes in text, and I went back to the Ante-Nicene Fathers as recorded in church history to see it for myself, and there it is. They were quoted out of context. And so sometimes these scholars are guilty of stacking up evidence to make it look a certain way, and that's just not the case. It was really quite shocking for me. And again, as I said, has led me to hold the longer ending of Mark as canonical. I do think it should be in the Bible. Because there's debate, should it be in brackets? That's another question. I would read it and teach it as scripture, myself personally, which is, if anyone's shocked by this, it's me. I'm shocked by the fact that I'm holding it this way. I haven't held it for years. If you look at this video and say, well, why are all the books you read in support of the ending of Mark? It's because I was against the ending of Mark. I held against that view that this was scripture. And so as I always try to do, I try to read against my biases. And in this case, as has happened before with me, I'm reading against my biases and my mind has changed upon further research and evidence. And so this book by far stands out to me as an exceptional book. The external evidence, as I already stated, caused me to relook at Jerome, relook at Eusebius. Jerome is evidence, I believe, based on the evidence for the longer ending of Mark, not against. He's strong evidence for, based on his canon of Scripture, how a preface he does to the Gospels, and he explains that in the earlier copies, the Greek copies, they all contained the longer ending of Mark, and those were the correct copies. That's what Jerome says. Eusebius, and again, Nicholas Lunn goes to great length. We see here in chapter 10. He also hints at it earlier, I believe in chapter 2. But what he talks about is that his theory is seeming that there was the Gnostics, or those heretics that believed that there was not a physical bodily resurrection of the Messiah. So there's these heretics, these false teachers that believe this, who live around Alexandria, who live around Egypt. Somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd century, there is this strong growing sect, this strong growing heresy, false teaching that Jesus wasn't resurrected physically, bodily. And so these false teachers, according to Nicholas Lunn's theory, begin to extract and cut off the ending of Mark, namely verse 9 through 20. And from this, they can then remove any reference to a bodily resurrection, as Mark reigned more supreme in those areas as the gospel that was circulated. But these Gnostics can still hold to a type of resurrection with verses 1 through 8 of chapter 16 without holding to a bodily resurrection. They can spiritualize it and make it more metaphysical, make it more Casper the Ghost type theology. So he really labors this external evidence well. Again, changed my mind completely. I would see Eusebius and Jerome as evidence for the longer ending of Mark. At Eusebius, maybe you could say he's inconclusive. For me personally, he's definitely not evidence against the ending of Mark. And when you take these guys out, okay, we have the first 2 centuries. There's no one arguing that Mark, verse 9 through 20, is unauthentic, non-canonical. Everyone either quotes it or doesn't quote it. But if they quote it, they're quoting it as scripture. We see this with Irenaeus and then possibly with other writers, say Clement or Justin Martyr. And then around the 3rd and 4th centuries, we have, say, Jerome and Eusebius. Eusebius comes first. And again, they are most often quoted along with Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus as this huge evidence for the earliest manuscripts that speak against it, along with these 2 early church great theologians that are speaking against it. But again, as I already mentioned, they're quoted out of context, and there's really not a strong case based upon the quotations often used to do that. And again, the codex that was closest to Saint Eusebius, I'm trying to remember, I can't remember if it's Vaticanus or Sinaiticus. One we're kind of unsure where it originated. The other is placed around Egypt in that same area. So where this sect was growing, according to Nicholas P. Lunn's theory, we have this sect growing, and this is right around the same area that Eusebius himself was at and had fled from, concerning persecution from Diocletian, etc., or maybe a mentor had fled. Anyways, they would put the faulty manuscripts that, as I've discussed before on this channel, have some shaky background with replacement leaves or with at least memorial space for these 2 codexes. It would place these 2 codexes and Eusebius himself around the same area. And so it's not till those later centuries, the 3rd and 4th centuries, where we have any mention whatsoever of a possible doubt. And again, as I've said, I'll say it the third time. To me, it's not a conclusive doubt. It's just one of two ways to reconcile the passage. But Eusebius himself reconciles the passage and closes his final answer out of the twofold answer is an answer of how to reconcile the texts. And then Jerome, he says in other places that the earlier Greek copies weren't corrupted, weren't messed up. And he goes on in the Vulgate to put the longer ending of Mark in there in his translation of the Bible, of which he bases not only off the text that Eusebius had, those manuscripts, but also off of earlier Greek ones that didn't have those problems. And he calls them the more accurate ones. And so for me, there was no doubt in 1st and 2nd century. Everyone quotes it unanimous. The strongest case that could be made is from Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and from Eusebius and Jerome. This book, for me personally, knocked them out of the water. If James Snap Jr.'s book didn't do that already, which it had already really caused some extremely strong doubts for me as to their case being against the longer ending of Mark. And then what we have is, for me, what I'm seeing in the evidence is support from Eusebius, support from Jerome, especially Jerome, and then we have seeming silence up until the 19th century with Westcott and Hort. So we have a long tradition with no hiccups or bumps in the road of everyone affirming, quoting. We have guys like Augustine who used the longer ending of Mark multiple times. It's all throughout the lectionaries. It's all throughout the Bibles, everywhere. And these two main codexes that are used to quote against it seem to not have hardly any bearing at all. And so, forgive me going on a rant, where I stand on this issue. He goes through the external evidence back to Nicholas Lunn's book. The linguistic evidence, for me, as I've already stated, internal evidence for textual criticism is often, in my opinion, personally, I've not read this anywhere, this is my personal opinion, it's biased, it's so subjective, I just don't like it. I think Nicholas Lunn did a good job of presenting the reality. He does in Linguistic Evidence Chapter 4 that the random words that are often attributed to Mark to say, these words are very spurious in verses 9 through 20. They don't match up anywhere else. If we apply the same logic and reasoning to other parts of Mark, we find the same exact thing. And again, while I'm here, often what's used against the longer ending of Mark is this argument of silence. And people say, well, this church father never mentioned it. Well, they didn't mention the rest of certain chapters of Mark. They didn't mention other books of the Bible. They didn't mention entire things. So, for example, I don't believe that John Calvin wrote a commentary on Revelation, if my memory serves me correctly. So what are we to say, that John Calvin rejected the entire book of Revelation as non-canonical? No, we would just say he didn't write a commentary. So that's an extremely common thing that me and James Snap Jr. talked about when we spoke, I believe, of Clement of Alexandria concerning his quotation or lack thereof in Mark. Well, what we find, if we look at all of his quotations of the entire book of Mark, he quotes next to none of it. James Snap, his data leads him to believe it's close to 1% of Mark is quoted. So the argument of silence, in my opinion, is absolute junk. It's just not helpful in any way, and it's inconsistent and biased. So he goes through the linguistic evidence. I think he did a great job, better than any other book I've read, Nicholas P. Lunn's linguistic evidence and internal evidence. But with that being said, other than proving the fact that he did apply a consistent analysis of random words, so for that reason, it was helpful to show that this is common, what most people use to prove these random spurious words specific to the longer ending of Mark. When we apply it to other stories in the Gospel of Mark, we find the same exact percentage numbers, say close to 17 or 20 or 12 of random words that aren't used elsewhere, according to my understanding. And then the last thing I'll talk about with his book is the thematic evidence. We do have If you've been watching the series I've done on Mark, you'll know this extremely well because I've covered this extensively in my series on Mark, but we have these themes. We have in the two-part videos I covered extensively in chapter 1 of the Gospel of Mark, this Elijah motif, which we covered how John the Baptist is one who is like Elijah, according to the Gospel of Mark. Another theme or motif that we find is the Exodus motif. We find this in the Gerasene demoniac. We find this with the feeding of the 5,000, with the breaking of the fish and the loaves. And there's a few other places we could point to, the Transfiguration, which he brings up in this book. Again, if you haven't and you want to understand this, please just watch the series on Mark. I know it's a big time commitment, but these things are all throughout, which he covers quite well in this book. I've covered on my channel extensively. And then again, we already mentioned his theory to the cause of the problem, and then his summary and conclusion. If you knock out those four things, Eusebius, Jerome, Codex Sinaiticus, and Codex Vaticanus, there's hardly zero case left to be made against the longer ending of Mark. And all we have is scores of fathers quoting it, scores of fathers affirming it, or in many cases we have fathers repeating Eusebius's quote, which is the twofold possible solving of the problem. And again, for Nicholas P. Lunn's book here, I think he does a great job of explaining the possible cause of the problem, which it would have seemingly originated with Gnostics who rejected a bodily resurrection of Jesus, extracting the longer ending of Mark to support their ideology and beliefs. And then it was seemingly very local to that area. And then later on, which would have been the same, a similar area that Eusebius was around, later on with Jerome, he fixes that issue and grafts this back in, what has been extracted. And all the while, in the rest of the known gospel preaching world, the longer ending went uninterrupted. And so this would explain Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, would also explain Eusebius's manuscripts that he has locally in his context that he has access to. And I think really solves the problem quite neatly. So this was an extremely helpful book, and I can't praise it enough. It definitely helped me come to some final conclusions concerning the longer ending of Mark.